I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here, the Royal Canadian Navy, the Daniel Inouye Center, the Navy League of Canada. I am greatly appreciative to be here, but nowhere near as appreciative of my students who got this week off because I'm up here in British Columbia. So they want me to thank you personally for this. Today I'm going to be talking about geopolitics, security, and the shipping industry. And 8 o'clock on the second day of a conference is always a challenge. So I'm going to try to keep you all entertained a bit while talking about what I think is the primacy of global shipping and how it relates to many of the topics that I heard yesterday in presentations. I can tell you how delighted I was to hear many of the references that we saw. Back in February of 2020, I had an opportunity to talk in a class, and I was talking about the maritime industry, and specifically, I asked the students in the class, well, I was asked specifically, what I thought the greatest threat facing global shipping was. And like a good professor, I turned it on the students. I was like, what do you think is the greatest threat facing them? And we had a whole list of things, a lot of piracy. Students love talking about piracy, so piracy came up quite a bit. And I finally was asked, okay, what do you think now, professor? And I said, COVID. I said, the outbreak of this new disease has the potential to do it. It was the greatest insight I've ever had as a professor. Let me be clear. If I could have retired, I would have dropped the mic right then and walked out, knowing that I made this insight. But in truth, the reason I said that was because I was doing research on the book I'm writing on sea lift during the First World War. And I had just been writing about the troop ships and the Spanish flu, and how the ships became the conduit for what became the greatest pandemic in human history at that point, until we hit 2020. And the impact on global shipping is pronounced. I pulled this up from just this week. While we were here at the conference and I was traveling, this is what I've pulled up for this week. It gives you a myriad of stories in global shipping, any one of which has major implications. Everything from a tug strike down in Australia, to the creation of a new LNG field in Mozambique, to Italy's policy about migrants in the Mediterranean. We see constantly in the news this level of attention with global shipping and the impact it is having. And this means that you as practitioners, you as establishing policy, and you out there on board vessels will have to deal with this. And I think one of the things that I was very confident and pleasant to see was how much we are talking about that role of global shipping. Because for many of you who are ship drivers out there, your interaction with global shipping is basically those big, huge lumbering ships that will not talk to you on the radio. And that's basically the element we have. So I'm going to take you through a series of elements here that I want to talk about, from the outbreak of COVID through the major sectors in the maritime industry, what's hitting them right now, and then talk about two specific examples, China and Russia, and how global shipping is really being impacted by them as we talk. COVID found its outbreak on board the cruise industry. And I don't think I have to point to you on the chart where COVID hit. Pretty obvious where we saw it happen. This is a sector that doesn't get a lot of attention lots of times from the industry. They tend to look their way against passenger cruise lines. But in truth, it was a very good indicator, because this was an industry that believed that nothing was going to impact it. It was going nothing but growth. That trajectory you see there from 1990 until 2020 was the perspective. Ships were being built, new ships were coming online, bigger and better was seen as the day. Consolidation was the name also across the industry. 3 cruise lines controlled 80% of all the cruise industry: Carnival, Royal Caribbean, and Norwegian. And then all of a sudden, in March of 2020, it stopped. It stopped. And one of the things that's really interesting about the cruise industry is the logistics behind the cruise industry, the ability of the ships to maintain deployments, but more importantly, how do you get the crews off? And there was a massive cross-decking that had to be done. It was a really telling element, but the industry had to bleed itself of resources. It had all of a sudden too many vessels, too much capacity. What do you do? And they started a massive scrapping campaign. This is the scrapping yard in Turkey, where you see 2 former Royal Caribbean and 3 Carnival cruise liners run up on the beach to be scrapped. Vessels that still had service life in them couldn't be sold. They were basically sold for nothing but the steel on board. And there was a lot of concern that this was going to be the trajectory for the other sectors, that as the cruise ship industry went, the other sectors was going to follow. But what we've seen is something a little bit different. So how has things changed? Admiral Toffee did a great job talking about the idea of the invisibility of ocean shipping, I think, and the importance of it. Books like Rose George, 90% of Everything, where she detailed what it's like for the mariners on board these vessels. Bruce Jones's To Rule the Waves, that talks about that post-World War II environment that has allowed the unimpeded growth of ocean trade. This statistic, which comes out of the UN's review of maritime transport, a must-read document if you ever want to read one. The latest version comes out the end of this month on maritime shipping. Talks about the growth in ocean trade. Not on the chart here, but about 1950, post-World War II, 5 years after the end of World War II, ocean shipping was 500 million tons. We were moving 500 million tons around the planet. By 1980, we were just under 4 billion tons. And we were on a trajectory by 2020 to hit almost 12 billion tons. And that means not only is consumption up, but our ability to move goods around the planet has increased exponentially. We are more efficient in moving goods. Most ocean transportation on products, on goods, is seamless. You don't see it. I'm going to talk about that in a second and how that relates to this. But this volume of shipping is really important. And what's interesting too is you see certain sectors are growing faster than others. The bulk trade, grain, ore, coal. Those are elements that we see moving in massive amounts. You hear about the shift over to green energy in electric cars. Well, every electric car needs a lot of copper, and copper has to come from somewhere. And we see that movement happening here. And this growth is doing nothing more. I had another chart I could have added here that talks about ton miles, how far you have to move a cargo. That's increasing too. So we're not just increasing the tonnage we're moving, but the distances involved that we're moving. So many different styles of trade out there, and I'm just going to focus on a few of them for you. I'm not going to get into details on all of them, but just a quick snapshot on what we've seen happen over the past 2 years when it comes to ocean shipping. I'm going to focus on 3 areas. I'm going to focus on containers, I'm going to talk about the tanker trade, and I'm going to talk about the bulk trade, because I think each of these have a really important element. Now, one of the things I think that's very difficult, and was very nice to talk about my YouTube channel, one of the things that I do on my channel was try to explain ocean shipping, make it relatable to people. Like almost every industry, people are great to talk among people within their industry. The problem is to talk to people outside of your industry and make it applicable. And one of the jobs, and I see this in the United States, is kind of how do you identify the mission for the US Navy? And I respect my Navy brethren in here very much, but sometimes when you all give your talks, you need that person in the corner translating what you're saying all the time. And it's hard to get that across. And one of the things I've tried to do with the supply chain in particularly is relate this. To me, the supply chain situation that happened in 2020, going on to the present, is akin to the disruption we saw in the world wars. We have never seen a global disruption on trade at that level except for the 2 world wars. And that's really where my study comes from. I was not studying commercial shipping, I was studying military logistics and sea lift. And what got me about 2020 and the COVID was this is akin to the disruptions we saw with submarines, with surface radar attacks, and the disruptions we were causing by convoying. And to me, we have to relate that. How do you make someone in, Saskatchewan, how do you make someone in Nebraska, how do you make someone in Munich appreciate what ocean shipping does for them? And we talk a lot about different styles of logistics, but I think the one way to get to them is how did COVID impact you directly? And I think everyone during it was impacted by one way or another by the toilet paper shortage. This is something that got everyone's attention. All of a sudden, toilet paper disappeared. Did COVID cause us to go to the bathroom more? Was there some issue that we were unaware of? Why all of a sudden was there a normal supply of toilet paper on the shelves and then it disappeared? When you talk about just-in logistics sometimes, people don't understand just-in logistics. It's hard for them to kind of fathom that idea. It's hard for people to understand that when they hit their smartphone and they hit that Amazon button and they push send, that product has been in movement for 120 to 180 days already. They knew you were going to order that, not you specifically, but they have an idea, they have the volume. And that movement has been going on for nearly 3 to 6 months. When you disrupt that movement, when you change the buying pattern, which COVID did, it changed the buying pattern. How do you change the buying pattern of toilet paper? People aren't at work, they're not at home. Commercial toilet paper was not being used, whereas residential toilet paper was being used. And what you had was a shortage. And I think we can all agree that when you need toilet paper, you need it just in time. And if it's not there, that is a problem. And that hits everybody. I won't say, but it's important. This is something that is very applicable. What happens when that supply chain is disrupted? Whether it's due to COVID, whether it's due to natural disasters, whether it's due to a myriad of events. One of the things I would argue that since the outbreak of COVID, we have seen a chain, a litany of events that have happened that have accelerated the disruption. And each of these kind of black swan events that they love to call them are happening and keeping the turbulent pool of the supply chain in flux. So for example, the container situation. We were all aware of the backlog off the ports of LA and Long Beach last year. If you look today at marine traffic or one of the AIS sites that we have out there, you'll see that there's very few ships sitting off LA and Long Beach. But at the peak of this, there were 109 vessels sitting off of LA and Long Beach in January of 2021. The amount of tonnage, cargo on those vessels was 60 times the amount that was landed in the first week of D-Day on June 6, 1944. And that was just sitting there. And I would argue this is not a shipping issue at this time. This is not shipping. We didn't have a problem with ships, got the ships, got the cargo. This was an infrastructure issue. This is the idea that that seamless flow of goods was being disrupted. Trains, railway, port capacity, workers, that ability, warehouses. This is a big, what we call in the shipping industry, throughput. You are not having a throughput. If you go back to the chart I had earlier, which showed you the different types of trade, it talked about how many days ships are in port versus how many days at sea. Shipping companies do not like this. They want to see their ships moving. They make money when the ships are moving. They don't make money when they're sitting in port. They maximize. We have turned on its head the idea of a ship in port versus a ship at sea. And for shipping companies, they maximize this on being at sea. How have we changed this? We've seen the routing of vessels change. The backlog isn't off LA and Long Beach anymore, it's off Savannah. Why is it off Savannah? Because the new Neo-Panamax vessels are using the new lane of the Panama Canal. Ships up to 15,000 containers are going through that one lane of the canal and heading to the East Coast to offload. Understand, we have created a worse choke point of the Panama Canal than we had previously. Previously, we had 2 lanes of the Panama Canal. 2016, we added a 3rd lane that can only accommodate certain size vessels, Neo-Panamax. And that lane is a precarious choke point that we tend not to think about. It's being impacted by global warming, Gatun Lake level. As it falls, you restrict the level of the ship going in. Ultra-large container vessels, vessels of over 18,000 containers, ships that were unheard of 10 years ago. 10 years ago, a ship with 8,000 boxes was massive. It was huge. The Everalot that went to sea this year, 24,000 boxes on board. Those ships are used exclusively on the Asia to Europe run. And one of the things that was found out was it's easier, it's almost a wash to get to the East Coast of the United States, either through the Panama Canal or through the Suez Canal. And as we saw with Ever Given, 6 days can shut off 12% of the world trade. And all it took was wind. And you wound up with a ship with its bow rammed into Asia and its stern perched on Africa and straddling the Suez and not exactly sure that vessel was going to get freed. And ships piled up at both ends of the canal, causing disruptions throughout the supply chain. We're seeing the growth of container lines across the industry. Look around the crowd here, we have representatives from many of the world's navies here, but one of the things that I can't help but notice is representatives from the largest fleet in the world is not here, and I'm not talking China. I'm talking about the commercial industries, Mediterranean Shipping Company, Maersk Shipping Line, TK Tankers right in Vancouver, one of the largest shipping lines in the world. The theme in passenger liners was consolidation. The theme in containers, also consolidation. 10 companies in 3 alliances control 85% of the world's trade on the oceans. And let's be clear, these companies have foreign policies. It was Maersk, MSC, Hauppauge that self-sanctioned Russia. It wasn't their governments telling them to do it, they did it on their own. They executed a foreign policy. Not since the East Indies companies have we seen shipping companies operate in such a way. And the connectivity of these ports, very select ports that can handle these vessels, we see how important they become. As we consolidate, as ships get larger and bigger, they can only go into certain areas, which means the threat and security of them become much more pronounced as we go. The tanker industry. Right now in tankers, we're seeing a lot of movement for obvious reasons. Energy consumption is changing. One of the greatest texts right now we're seeing in the maritime sector is what is going to be the next mode of propulsion. The IMO, the International Maritime Organization, back in January 1st, if you had told me what the big story was going to be in 2020 for shipping, I would tell you it was IMO 2020, the shift to very low sulfur fuel oil. That was going to be the story. But now what we're seeing is that the IMO is calling for 50% decarbonization on vessels based on the 2008 levels by 2050. That's going to be accelerated. That's going to be accelerated. We're already seeing nations and ports talk about green corridors being established, new fuels coming in. We're seeing the birth of hydrogen fuel, ammonia fuel, LNG, hybrid electricity power, and we're even going back to the days of sail, with large sails being put. China just launched a VLCC, a very large crude carrier with sails on board, reduced fuel consumption by 10%. So we're seeing that change. But one of the most interesting areas is liquefied natural gas, both in methods of propulsion, but in transportation and fuel. As we see Europe shifting away from the nuclear power, and then with Russia, Ukraine, all of a sudden liquefied natural gas became a massive commodity. The US started exporting LNG in 2016 and has become one of the 3 top countries doing it. The US, Australia, Qatar, all are exporting LNG in huge amounts. Right now, off of Europe are sitting about 24 liquefied natural gas carriers waiting to offload because of an unusually warmer summer in Europe. The energy consumption isn't what it is, and you just can't take liquefied natural gas and offload it. You have to turn it from a liquid at 260 degrees below Fahrenheit, 165, I think it is, Celsius. I apologize, I'm an American, we do terrible math. You have to change it, you have to have these regasification units. These ships, however, are in huge demand. If you look at LNG consumption, China was one of the largest consumers. China sold much of its loads of LNG to Europe for massive profit. LNG carriers right now are earning on average about $500,000 a day just for charter rates. And you have 20 of them sitting off Europe right now. What happens when Europe is in need of LNG and all of a sudden Asia needs its LNG, China needs its LNG, and you have a global competition for resources, for power. And this is what we're seeing, especially in countries like Australia and US that don't have their own national LNG fleets. They're completely dependent on commercial carriers for the allocation of their resources. Then we talk about the bulk trade. This is the AIS map for right off here in beautiful Victoria. And the bulk trade is one of the biggest growing sectors we see. I mentioned before, ore, grain, wheat, coal, all of this is being done. But understand that the bulk trade is in a bit of flux. Dr. Peterson from the Naval War College was talking about the shipment of grain and the importance, and he remarked how much that he was surprised that grain hasn't really fluctuated terribly. We didn't see the huge spike in inflation. But if you look around the world right now, we were talking about global warming. The Mississippi River is down at one of its lowest levels, preempting the shipment of grain from the interior of the United States. the Parana River down in South America, the Yangtze in China, the Rhine in Europe. Many other rivers are down, but these are major thoroughfares for traffic, and we see them down. On the Mississippi, this means that a tug and barge that usually has 40 barges is restricted now in the draft of its barges down to 25 barges. And that means not only is the grain not getting down, but fertilizer is not getting back up, which is going to impact future grain production. In Canada, the Fraser River and the floods that hit British Columbia knocked out the rail lines from the center part of Canada all the way to the Port of Vancouver. And the Port of Vancouver is still feeling that today. This was a report from Flexport, freight forwarder for last week. Ships in Vancouver are waiting 29 days to load. So when you go out and you see the bulk carriers sitting there off Vancouver and off Victoria, this is one of those ramifications. You just can't get the grain out of central Canada onto the bulk carriers and into the world market that is in desperate need of it. I want to take a second and talk about the two case studies, and that is China and Russia, and I'll be very brief on these. So China, saw this chart yesterday on the Belt and Road Initiative, which I found very interesting. I agree entirely with the discussion that was held on the Belt and Road Initiative. I think this is purely a commercial peacetime endeavor. And one of the things that China has embarked upon is redundancy in its marketplaces, in its imports, and its resources. We've seen that happen. Early in COVID, we saw a dispute between Australia and China. That resulted in China boycotting, not taking bulk material from Australia, which is one of its largest sources. Instead, where'd it go? It went to Africa. It went to South America to get its trade. And we see that. We talk about China setting up ports around the world. I agree. I don't think they're military bases, they're ports. But I also think they're a little different than ports we think of today. Because I think the Chinese model is not capitalism, it's not communism, it's mercantilism. They are more akin to the British of the 18th century than the free market economy today. They see those elements as footholds. I can't help but note that a lot of times in their treaty negotiations, they go for 99-year leases, the same exact lease terms that the British gave the Chinese in the Treaty of Nanking in 1842 after the Opium War. They are basically cementing themselves. But the thing that I wanted to highlight was the routes. I think the routes, the ocean routes in particularly. China is setting up alternative routes. You heard the great talk by Greg Poling about South China Sea. I think China is more concerned not with a peer-to-peer threat from the US Navy. I think they realize that a peer-to-peer threat going toe-to-toe with the 7th Fleet is a Pyrrhic victory for both sides. They both come out as a loser on that. But the fear they have is the small and medium power that can interdict them, that can cause the disruption. If you ever watch marine traffic when a hurricane goes through, one of the things you'll see is that little blue dot appear where all the ships scatter and get away from it. And I think that's what China worries about, because China has a very unique view of the world. Now, I swear, Admiral Kavanaugh, I did not steal this slide from the talk you gave yesterday. I had this one already in the can beforehand. A lot of the other slides I stole, but this one I made. This is the view China has of the world. Take Google Earth, rotate it 90 degrees so it looks outside. There's a great historian by the name of Clark Reynolds, wrote a book entitled Navies in History. And he includes in there a series of maps, and he always loved to do this, turn the world a little bit different and look at that. When we were out the other day on our cruise on the Edmonton, it was noted to me that everywhere you look out there, you're surrounded by the United States. And for that, I'm sorry. But it was safe passage. There's not a concern with that. When China looks outside, it sees this. It sees that every exit point into the world's ocean is covered by another power. It's covered by another nation. And one of the reasons why I would argue that China is developing in the South Pacific, for example, is what happens if the South China Sea, the Malacca, the Sunda, the Lombok Straits are shut to them, even for a brief period of time. They're going to have to route. We know ocean shipping will go wherever it has to go. When Ever Given went sideways in the Suez, on day 6 of that event, ships were starting to route around Africa. They were not going to wait any longer. They were going to start moving. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, when the Suez was shut for 8 years, ships went around Africa. They are like, water and cracks on the sidewalk. They'll find a way around. During the early part of World War II, and the study I'm doing is early World War II logistics, the US had to establish a fueling base in Bora Bora to sustain a supply line across the Pacific to Australia, because ships had to travel that distance because Australia didn't have the fuel to give to refuel vessels. So the US had assumed that duty. In China, if they can't get through the South China Straits, they're gonna be heading to Australia, New Zealand, around that way to go. They'll head for the Drake Passage, the southern passage between Antarctica and South America, and they'll head to the Arctic and use that route to get around. The Russians, on day one of Ever Given going aground, offered that route up for everybody. They were free to use it. And so I think China definitely has it. Look what China's doing. COSCO is the largest shipping line in the world today. China builds 40% of the world's ships. They have a port infrastructure around the world, just bought 25% of one of the terminals in Hamburg. We see them growing in their ability to sustain themselves. They're getting blue water experience through their shipping. Greg talked about the maritime militias, all the merchant sailors in China, and China is the second largest group of merchant sailors in the world right now, closing on the Philippines. Most of their merchant sailors have backgrounds in military training also, and naval training. That takes us to Russia. I think it's still Russia, I'm not sure. It changes every now and then. Russia and the Black Sea. I think for many of us, you would look at what's happening in the Black Sea and sit there and say the Russians are losing. It's pretty clear. You look, Snake Island, retaken by the Ukrainians, the sinking of the Moskva, the attack on Berdansk, the attack on the Kerch Bridge, the kamikaze kayaks that went into Sevastopol. I think for many of us would militarily look at this event and sit there and say the Russians are losing. They are not succeeding at all. Whereas myself, from a commercial application, would say, this doesn't matter because the Russians are winning commercially. They're winning because their vessels are sailing out. They're carrying the food, the fuel, the fertilizer that they need to sustain their economy. One of the reasons why I would argue that Russia went into Ukraine was to secure not just the land bridge to Crimea, but the Sea of Azov, that small sea around Crimea, which is the ingress and egress route to the Don River. The Don River leads you to the Volga, it leads you to the Caspian, it leads you to the Baltic. It is the Mississippi River of Russia. And the fact that Russian ships had to sail past Mariupol and Berdansk was always a threat to them. It could always be severed and cut off. And I think that's one of the big things. I think one of the things to watch here for is the Ukrainian retaking of Kherson and that drive back to the Sea of Azov. But for Russia, the food and the fertilizer are flowing. Fuel is another issue. The looming G7 price cap, starting in December 5th, that has unique potential. But it's going to be a very difficult one. I would argue that the G7 and the EU are trying to get a little bit of both. They want to keep Russian oil flowing, but they want to hurt them economically at the same time. And this is where we're seeing a lot that the technology out in the hallway would help you with, is this visualization of the Russian ghost fleet of tankers. We're seeing ship-to-ship transfers of fuel in the Eastern Atlantic out in the area off Singapore to the east of it. We're seeing basically the laundering of oil. We've seen this with Iran and Venezuela and North Korea, but now we're seeing it on a huge scale with Russia. And remember, the Russian oil has to just get to another nation to be refined, and it can be sold on the open market back to everybody, because that's new oil at that point. Very hard to identify this. So in conclusion, my view here is really the importance that ocean shipping has on not just military strategy, geopolitics, but on the everyday life. Again, it is an industry that is not visualized by most people. Most people who have any identification with global shipping would see it from the time they spend on a cruise ship, and maybe if they go by a port and see a vessel. But we have detached this from us. The three largest Registries in the world today are Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands. The 5 nations that provide the most mariners in the world today are the Philippines, China, India, Indonesia, and Russia. The countries that build most of the world's vessels, 93%, are China, South Korea, Japan. The nations that scrap, recycle most of the world's ships are Turkey, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And for most of us, we don't see it. We see new efforts undertaking the idea for national fleets, South Africa, Australia, the United States, even Canada, talking about this idea of having a reservoir of ships at least to supplement. Because one of the things we've seen is how little disruptions can cause chaos down the supply chain. COSCO, the Chinese overseas shipping company, represents about 15% of the world's fleet. What happens tomorrow if China takes that 15% out of trade? What if they target a specific nation and decide to cut that trade with them? It causes that disruptions in the supply chain. And all of a sudden you find yourself in a precarious situation where you've counted on just-in-time logistics and you don't have another roll of toilet paper in the house. And I think that's the danger we see if we don't spend time and pay attention to what's going on with global shipping. Thank you. I appreciate the time.
Sal, thank you so much. That was me. I don't know where to begin. But let me start with thank you so much for filling in the blanks. We love to say at the beginning of our presentations, 90% of everything moves by sea, but you help provide those details to fill in there. What's moving by sea? When is it moving by sea? How not is it moving by sea? As we go into our Q&A session here, I'd like to just take moderator's prerogative and kind of take you up with a question on your last point there. So, and your first point. So you mentioned at the outset that COVID was the largest disruptor to international shipping since World War II. We have emerged from that pandemic, but unevenly. So many countries in the West have largely released their COVID restrictions, but others have not. In particular, China is still very much applying a zero COVID strategy to managing the pandemic. How do you see this uneven application of restrictions creating bottlenecks and further logjams for international shipping?
So one of the things that we saw with COVID restrictions in particular is, number one, the amazing element that shipping was really not disrupted by COVID outbreaks on board the vessels. It was amazing. During that first period of time, we really didn't see, except for very isolated times, where we had COVID vessels. You got to think there's about 100,000 vessels over 100 gross tons. You're talking about an employment of 1.5 to 1.8 million mariners. So a couple of things happened right off the bat that was significant, that really was a problem, is that because of COVID restrictions, you couldn't do crew changes. So for mariners who were sailing, that you'd signed up for 4 months on board a vessel, at the end of their 4 months, they couldn't get home because of COVID restrictions in countries, because mariners were not designated as essential workers in many places. They were forced to stay on well above. Matter of fact, the International Labor Convention, which oversees the requirements for mariners, have a mandate that you cannot be more than a year on a vessel. They had to waive that because mariners were at sea for more than a year in some cases. And this had ramifications down the labor pool. Because if you can't get off, what is your odds of coming back on once you're off? What happens to your replacement who's on shore not getting paid? They're going to go find a different job. And then all of a sudden what we had was jeopardy in the supply chain of moving personnel. We saw a lot of accidents actually start happening. We had a very terrible shipwreck, the Wachovia off of Mauritius that ran aground. We just saw this, it's not exactly clear, Ever Given wasn't for that situation too, where you have a ship that's 400 meters in length, it has a crew of 25 on board. How long have they been on board? We all know, if you've been through the Suez, how tiring a sea detail that is. And was that an element of that? Now we're seeing a lot of crew changes were being taken place in countries now that weren't allowing it, but now China has shut out crew changes. And I think this is part of an effort, by the way, by China, again, to really increase their footprint on vessels around the world. China not allowing crew changes to take place, since many vessels are routing through China. That was the place that many countries would do it. You were using Asians largely for that, including Russians. You can route them into China fairly easily and do the crew changes, and now we're not seeing that. So I think it's really an unheralded role that we saw with seafarers. They kept the supply chain moving the entire time. Again, there's a lot of unsung heroes we talk about, but for me, I think that's a really important element. I think COVID, again, when you create those disruptions in the normal patterns for mariners, that's going to cause disruptions down the chain, which again, opens the way for new mariners. There was a big concern during Russia-Ukraine war because Russian and Ukrainians sailed together lots of times on vessels. And what was really interesting is we saw a lot of images of Russian-Ukrainian crews taking pictures together, just showing the fact that they're putting aside those differences because a lot of the Ukrainians couldn't get home, but that was due to the war, not so much COVID.
Great. Thanks, Sal. Actually, Jocelyn, if I can be greedy just for one more moment, you gave us a bit of a retrospective picture, and I think it's pretty clear that just-in-time isn't working for us right now and in the future. Can you offer a bit of prediction, as foolish as that is how shipping models might evolve to avoid these disruptions?
So one of the things that you heard a lot was, okay, this is going to destroy just-in-time logistics. We're going to, shift from our dependence on overseas manufacturing, and we're going to start, reshoring, bringing industries back. As long as shipping is the cheapest way to move things, and this is an element. I did one of the videos I did was based on an image that a friend sent me from Washington, D.C. She was sitting down for lunch, and she was eating a container of peaches. She had a little plastic container of peaches. And on the side of that container of peaches, she's in Washington, D.C., side of that container of peaches, it said, grown in Argentina, packaged in Thailand. And just unpack that for a second, that it was cheaper to grow peaches in Argentina, bundle them together, put them on a boat, sail them to Thailand, halfway around the world, offload them, repack them, then sail them halfway around the world, probably to the port of LA or Long Beach, put them on a train, send them across country to put into a store so that she can buy them to have lunch. As long as that transportation cost is invisible, which is basically what it is when you get into large quantities, that we're still going to see that done. However, I do think everybody realizes now, to a large extent, and we see that, at least in the United States, with visibility, with the passage of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, that we are more dependent than ever, and that we really need not to, maybe the deregulation and free market is not always the best thing. There needs to be oversight, there needs to be control. And again, go back to what Bruce Jones talks about in his book, To Rule the Waves. No one's benefited more from freedom of the seas than nations like China, for example. They have grown, they've developed as a benefit from that. That protection that's provided not just by the US Navy, but by the world's navies, have really made the oceans a open marketplace, a conduit for trade. And the concern we see emerging is that those are potentially closing in. And the oceans may not be as free as we once thought they were. And that disruption, I think, is the big one looming on the horizon.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for bringing it back to what's really salient for everyone in the room. And I guess we'll go over to questions from the audience now. If I can please remind you to make your questions and not extended comments. Thank you very much.
Yes, good morning. Jeff Otto from the BCIT Marine Campus, where we train merchant mariners, actually. I was wondering if you can enlighten the navies of the world that are present today with regards to future challenges regarding recruitment of mariners, as the navies are facing those challenges right now, to sort of give them an idea of what the merchant fleet faces as well from your perspective. Thank you.
It's extremely difficult, I would argue, because of pay, because of time at sea, because of the requirements on training. There was a kind of a perception that, Liberian flag, Panamanian flag, those ships are, they're terrible ships and they're crewed by people who aren't well trained. That's not the case. I mean, they tend to be actually fairly newer ships, and the requirements for mariner training now is very extensive. I have, a lot of friends who still have license and certificates, and they spend most of their time when they're off the vessel training. They have to maintain it. And so it's very difficult to recruit. One of the things that we see that's changing a lot is ships are trying to make life on board the vessels better. Internet is a big thing. The ship that went aground off Mauritius, one of the allegations was the ship was getting close to land so that they can get cell service to do it. When Los Angeles decided to move the ships off of the anchorage and send them out to sea, they did it because of safety, they said, because of air quality, but it was a huge detriment to the crews because at least they had contact with the world. A lot of ships don't have uplinks for that. And so recruiting for mariners is a big challenge. The fear I have with it is that right now the International Maritime Labor Organization just renegotiated out a new minimum wage for mariners, which a lot of the companies fought very hard. They did not want to agree to this minimum wage increase. Minimum wage for mariners right now is about $658 a month, US, so about $22, $21 a day. And that is low, obviously, for Western standards, but there are nations around the world where that's good. But the problem is that shipping companies will go look for mariners in other places. And that's the thing we get worried about, is they'll start shopping around to find mariners out there. And what's the training and quality of those mariners? Coast Guard, US Coast Guard's here, they're our port state control in the United States. They can attest the difficulty in certifying and inspecting the volume of vessels that are coming in. So it's very difficult to ascertain whether or not everyone is up at the full training and qualifications that they need. So I think recruitment, the other thing, you know, in a lot of Western countries, United States, Canada, Europe, Asia, across the board, there's a strong appeal not to go to sea because they don't want to be away. They can make as much money on shore and be home every night, on the weekends, holidays, birthdays, as everybody else. Whereas, you know, as a merchant mariner, you sign on board, you're gone for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, and you can't really control it. And you know, every day is Monday at sea.
Thanks, Sol. Great presentation. That's fantastic. Pete Levy from the Royal Australian Navy. A similar theme. You mentioned at the end of your presentation countries like the US, Canada, and even Australia looking or discussing potentially reinvigorating a national fleet. Do you have any thoughts on how that might proceed, given the cost drivers, particularly on crew that you just mentioned? How can we make that economically viable?
Well, I think a couple of elements is it's very difficult right now because a lot of countries have lost a lot of the infrastructure they needed for it. Shipbuilding, for example. I would argue that one of the things that's the bane of the US today, in using the US as an example, is we don't have a robust commercial shipbuilding to supplement the Navy. If you look at Japan, Korea, and China, their shipyards are building not just commercial vessels, but military vessels. And so they get a benefit. And I know a warship is much different than a commercial ship, but you still have a lot of the facilities, a lot of the infrastructure, and even a lot of the work is very similar. I think you have to be very targeted in where you want to go. In the United States, I've been advocating for LNGs, tankers, for example. I think whereas the US built LNG tankers in the 70s and 80s, it'll take a long time to start that back up again. I think you waive some requirements right now. You get some LNGs on the open market. You may have to provide a government subsidy or a tax incentive to do that, to bring it in. But again, I think that in turn generates revenue for you. For Australia, the bulk trade, I think bulk traders are essential so that when China shuts down, for example, you know, what you have is you can then shift those ships to other routes, to move cargo into other areas and sell them. You're not at the mercy. We're seeing right now in the northeast part of the United States a diesel shortage. Well, there's not a diesel shortage. The problem is diesel fuel is being shipped overseas to Europe, wherever the marketplace wants it. And so you're pulling it from one place to give it to another, and now they're sending it back because they're getting more money for it. And again, I don't think a national fleet means that you're carrying 100% of your commerce by any means. But again, we see disruptions. In 2017, Maersk got hit by a cyber attack, the NotPetya virus. And it wasn't targeted at Maersk, it was incidental. They were not the target of it. They just uploaded it into their system. And because of the commercial nature of shipping, their units are all connected. They have to share data in an open forum. And what happened was Maersk went down. It infected every server, every computer in the line, and they shut down for a week. The only thing that saved them was there was one server in Lagos, Nigeria that was offline because of a blackout. So they had redundancy. But you lost that capacity for a week, which in 2017 wasn't a problem because there was excess capacity. If that had happened during the height of COVID, that would have been detrimental. It would have been terrible. And I think this is the element that national fleets come in. What happens if a national fleet like Costco decides we're going to slow down sailing to you? You know, how can you repurpose some of your ships to fill that gap in some ways? So I think that's the way you sell. I think at times we talk about military useful vessels, which tends to mean they can carry tanks or fuel. But I think we need to look at strategic useful vessels. How do they help the economy of the nation? And how do they support in time of needs?
And I guess that would require some sort of subsidies, right? I get that's the rationale for doing it. Makes perfect sense. In time short of sort of a conflict, though, they still need to be commercially viable. So I'm guessing you need some form of government subsidy to reduce the wages, or to compensate for the wages if you want to use your own crew, things like that.
Yeah, it's not a level playing field out there, and there isn't any way. CSIS did a study on Chinese shipbuilding subsidies, 2010 to 2018. China spent 132 billion that they could identify in shipbuilding subsidies. In the United States, the Maritime Administration, through their Title 11 grant program, in that same period, made available 77, not billion, million dollars. So you know, it's hard to compare. Korea has just announced a $2 billion shipbuilding program to assist. You know, they've taken over HMM, one of the largest container lines in the world, because they don't want to see what happened with Hanjin happen to them. They see, again, priorities. And I think, again, one of the things that the supply chain has done is raise the level of attention of people. I joke about the toilet paper, but people are more cognizant of their dependency on ocean shipping. I think it really behooves all of us to raise that where we can, that this is how dependent we are on shipping. You know, it's not an isolated event. And when those events happen, we have to put context to it. And I think that's what we tend not to do lots of times. We shy away, we get away from it, we don't want to be associated with a disaster. But I think context is really important, because that's when people understand it. Believe me, people understand when they don't have toilet paper. They understand that, so.
Yes, I have a question on the Northern Sea Route. What is the current thinking of Western shipping companies on the one hand and Chinese companies on the other hand on the potential and the future potential for the Russian Northern Sea Route?
I'm sorry, what was the viewpoint on what? I didn't catch the very last part, I apologize.
Excuse me, I wanted to make a distinction between the Western companies and China, because I know that the Western companies, shipping companies, didn't see much prospect in the future in the Russian Sea Route, but China is designing as designs for ships to use the Northern Sea Route. So I wanted to have your take on that point.
Sure. So back in 2017, matter of fact, Maersk sent several of their container ships through the Northeast Passage from Rotterdam to Vladivostok. They basically pulled the ships they use on the Baltic route up to do that. And several other companies have expressed interest into it. Some have said, we don't want to go in the Arctic. It's just, we're worried about going into that environment. We just don't think it's available. Understand, you can't just pull a normal ship into it. You do need to have ships that are ice strengthened to go through that route. But I always go back to the fallback, where companies today say they're not interested in it. If tomorrow the Suez closes, if there's an incident in the South China Sea, and you're adding thousands of extra miles, which to a shipping company is cost, then the Arctic is going to look a lot better to them. And they will take that route if they have to. I think right now, the Russians were trying to do, and we see Russia doing it with the Yamal LNGs. We just saw an LNG tanker come through that route. It's one of the latest we've seen one come through in November, through that route, delivering to China. And so it is a viable route. You understand, it's a substantial shorter run. And if you think about it, think about the choke points you avoid going from the east coast of Asia to Rotterdam, for example, that you don't have to worry about. I mean, it's Malacca, it's the southern tip of India, it's the Bab el Mandab, it's Suez, it's the Sicilian Straits, it's Gibraltar, it's a myriad of things that you avoid. Now, you do need Russian escorts, you need breakers for that. There are still some choke points through Russian territory. But Russia has been trying this. They were selling that very hard. I can't tell you, as soon as Ever Given went ashore, they were in contact with shipping lines like, hey, we got a solution for you. You know, we will take you the route. If it wasn't March, I think they would have gotten away with it. It was like one of the worst times for them to do it. But I think it's a viable route, and it's why China, in my argument, is building icebreakers for that reason, to be able to get their ships through that route. They see that as a viable route to move.
Good morning, sir. Kevin Carley with the Naval Association of Canada. Pre-COVID, one of the biggest issues that involved many navies, including the Royal Canadian Navy, was maritime piracy. And it seems to have faded, certainly from the headlines, and I was wondering if you might comment on whether that's a threat or a risk that's still potential.
So if you go International Maritime Bureau and you pull up their piracy map, you'll see where piracy is in still full-fledged. The east coast of Africa is not, but you're seeing a really nasty element of piracy on the west coast of Africa that's being addressed by several nations that have sent down. You're talking about killing of crews, stealing of vessels and cargoes. South China Sea, in and around the area around Singapore, you see multiple boardings of vessels right now at anchors. Those tend to be more robberies than pirating, you know, just coming on board, seeing what they can grab. But I think one of the things that was really interesting about the piracy was how China embarked on the piracy issue. Just to go flip this just for a second, you know, a lot of people want to talk about the fact that China doesn't have a big global footprint, they can't deploy. I think Djibouti and the base there is a good example of that. They deployed their forces to protect their trade. That's where they went. That's what they see their mission as. Very much, I think the Chinese have done something that most naval people have never done, is they've actually read Mahan. And then they digest it, because Mahan's a terrible read. It's 19th century, it's terrible. But unlike most people who say they've read it, they have. And they've embraced it. And they are going overseas to protect their trade routes. And you see the number of deployments they've done, frigates, destroyers, support vessels. They've built up that issue. They're a true focusing on their trade. And I think the piracy element is very interesting. I think the danger in shipping is, I go back to what I talked about just a second ago, is cyber. One of the things we saw throughout COVID was multiple cyber attacks on shipping firms. And not just shipping firms, ports. South Africa was devastated by a cyber attack. The International Maritime Organization was hit by a cyber attack. And because of these open networks, they are very susceptible to it. Understand, you know, 20,000 boxes on a container ship, that's not being unloaded by the crew on board. That is a scripted choreograph that has to take place when the lines are thrown on and the cargo starts coming off. And if you throw a cyber attack into this and you lose that data, you're not moving the cargo. And again, it goes back to the throughput. How do you cause disruptions in this? Half the ship-to-shore cranes in the United States are built by China, ZPMC cranes, with the hardware and software from China. And so, you know, what's that element mean? So I think when we think of piracy, we have to look at it in many different ways.
Hey, thanks so much. Wonder if you could muse a little bit about the belt part of the Belt and Road, the mainland routes, Myanmar, China Economic Corridor, Pakistan Economic Corridor, and the high-speed rail links to Europe. What's China's goal here? How much can it really bake in redundancy into its trade routes using land routes that are more inefficient and expensive?
Right, and you know, one of the things that happened before Russia-Ukraine war was you really saw the development of those rail routes. I mean, if you look at the graph on the number of trains and they're going, it's amazing. You know, go from several hundred to double-digit thousands that they're moving. You know, China, again, the historian in me goes back to what is China thinking with the Belt and Road, and I go back to the 1930s. I go back to 1930s when China found itself really isolated. If you know, one area that's getting a lot of attention in World War II right now is the land war in Asia, which doesn't get a lot of attention at all usually. But if you look at what happened to China in the 1930s, it got cut off. The Japanese plan was to sever its outside contact. It seized its ports. It went into what is modern day northern Vietnam, Indochina. It cut the Burma Road, and China was isolated, but China could operate isolated. You know, what you saw was a logistics system that had to overcome that. The Burma Road, and when the Burma Road got shut down, the hump, the fly cargo in, then the Lido Road. And I think China looked at what happened to Japan, how Japan lost World War II. And unlike many Americans, I don't think our two big bombs were the thing that ended World War II. I think it was a myriad of issues that ended World War II. It was the systematic bombing, it was the blockade, it was the threat of an invasion. And I think the Belt and Road is China's effort to build redundancy into a lot of its elements. One of the things you're seeing right now is when Russia-Ukraine happened, that rail route that was going across Russia into Germany got severed. Well, they have shifted it over to Kazakhstan, the Central Asia route, and now China is on the Black Sea. A lot of cargo that was going via that rail route is now going into Novorossiysk and those ports along the Black Sea in Turkey, and then being carried across the Black Sea into Europe that way. And you're right, tonnage, you can never get the tonnage for that. You're never going to be able to ascertain that, but you can move lightweight, high value cargo that is really premium that you don't want to put on air all the time. And you create that redundancy in there. And I think that's always China's element, is to build that in there in one way or another to ensure that if I lose the bulk trade coming out of Australia, I can get it out of South Africa, I can get it out of Argentina and Brazil, and always have it.
For one more quick question, if anyone wants to take the opportunity. Oh, Jocelyn. Yeah.
I'm Brian Peskett. I'm with the Marine Institute over in Newfoundland. Flag of convenience has been a very common business practice, and I'm actually curious if you're seeing any geopolitical friction points as a result of that practice, and by extension, I'm curious if there's any future security challenges that you see from these legally anonymous vessels operating around the globe.
I think one of the things you're seeing right now is a lot of operators are realizing kind of the danger of an open registry at times. Ever Given, for example, flew the Panamanian flag, and that vessel, after it was freed, was held by the Egyptians for 100 days because the Egyptians arrested the vessel and fined it almost $1 billion for it. And so I think a lot of nations are looking at that again. The issue is cost, is the amount of money you pay for the Panamanians to register a ship versus another one. And to tell you the truth, why would you register your vessel anywhere else when you've reaped the benefit of the free oceans around the world? In many ways, the U.S. are to blame for part of this, in that we helped create the Panamanian, the Liberian, and the Marshall Islands registry. And so we created it. It's only when you have a priority that you see it change. So that, go back to the piracy issue on the east coast of Africa. While there's a lot of attention given to the capture of the Maersk Alabama and the amount of resources the amount of resources devoted to it, because you have to save Tom Hanks. That was not the case for the vessels under the open registries that were sitting there at the same exact time, that were being held for millions of dollars at it. And I think one of the things that you would see, especially in the Black Sea, and I'll give you the Black Sea analogy here, is one of the things I think the Russians are very concerned about is that the Ukrainians are pushing further and further out into the Black Sea. And as they move across that peninsula toward the Sea of Azov, could they start hitting Russian ships? They just announced that the Russians are not allowing any non-Russian ships under the Kerch Strait into the Sea of Azov. I also think that's an element there, not just for security of the Kerch Bridge, but they don't want neutral vessels targeted. They don't want this to explode into the tanker wars of the 1980s. And that's the danger. We saw commercial ships hit early in this conflict. And there was really no, we don't see NATO going into the Black Sea to protect them. We're not seeing convoys set up to run out. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, I would argue, is a win for Russia, because while Ukraine's getting 10 million tons of grain out, they would have hauled 3 times that amount if the war wasn't on. But more importantly, Russian ships are protected coming out of the Black Sea. And so this is the geopolitics that gets into this. It is useful to have that flag, that open registry flag, flying from your stern until there's a threat.
And that's what the Kuwaitis found out in in the tanker war, when they realized that they couldn't protect their own ship and they had the reflagging over to the US, and you had Ernest Will and you had the Operation Praying Mantis.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Sal. I think we'll leave them wanting more, which is always a great note to end on. But thank you very much, Sal. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll please assist me in thanking him for that presentation.